The Rebellers by Jane Roberts. A novel. Read by Martin John. Chapter 15. The possibility of such a tragedy suddenly occurred to everyone at once. Threats and counter-threats rose up. Those at the rear of the room rushed out into the hall. Toby yelled for silence, but the auditorium emptied in seconds. Gunny shouted louder than anyone else. The men crowded and shoved their way down past the lower cells to the tunnel. They then came to a halt. Fitch and Toby followed. They couldn't tell whether the guards had been found dead or alive. The other end of the tunnel was thick with people-haters. Their spokesman ran toward them. "We've made a deal," he shouted frantically. "It's all right. Don't harm the guards." There was a scuffle as the guards were set free. Toby and Fitch grinned with relief. Gunny said, "Damned people-haters," but Fitch just laughed. "You wanted action," he said to Gunny. "Well, you're going to get it. It's your job to organize that bunch into some kind of order. And I mean order. I want the rebellers in units of 20 men each. Mix the people-haters in with those groups so that we can all keep our eyes on them. Well, get them inoculated right away, too," Toby said. "We don't want any trouble of that sort before we even get started." That night, the people in the main square of the Imraburo subdivision of the Contrapolis of the Northeast were treated to the strangest sight they've ever seen. Up from the manholes came over 600 men, dressed in heavy woolen robes. They were shouting their heads off. They emerged into the heart of the borough, marched in military line past the crowds, and continued to the main borough building, followed by the curious masses. The people were so intimidated by the rebellers' orderly formations that they never made a move. Except for the singing and shouting, the rebellers were orderly, and determination showed in all of their faces. Two of them, Fitch and Toby, disappeared into the borough building. A minute later, Toby's rich voice suddenly rang throughout all the squares in the borough through the reactivated loudspeakers. The immediate effect, after the loudspeakers' silence, was electrifying. Cries of amazement went up all over. From everywhere the people rushed to hear what was going on. "This is your new government," Toby said. His voice was deliberate yet triumphant and authoritative. "Your own officials deserted you. The artists and the rebellers, and even the people-haters, have joined forces to help you and to help themselves. Together we can lick the plague, but only if everyone does his part. We aren't here to do the job for you. I, personally, refuse to do that. We're here to help you do the job for yourselves. First, the population will be divided into work units. Those who refuse to work will be denied food from the chemical gardens. However, food will be distributed every day from the squares for all those who join in fighting the plague. Inoculations will begin at once. Official doctors left with the others. You do not have to fear the doctors who will inoculate you. They are members of the rebellers. Repeat, you have nothing to fear from inoculations or from our doctors. Inoculations are compulsory. Those who refuse will not be fed. This rule is for your own protection. We are in control. You are not abandoned. Toby's voice was at its most dramatic and convincing. Nevertheless, rioting broke out at the mention of mass inoculations. All night long, the new forces were busy enforcing this point alone. In some places, whole crowds were inoculated at gunpoint. The rebellers had been pinned up for so long that their energy was tremendous, but there was no letting up. In the morning, Fitch held an emergency meeting in the mayor's old office. He was intent and worried. The street cleaners just reported the daily plague deaths. 487 yesterday. Inoculations are being carried out, but now there's something else. The street cleaners refuse to pick the bodies up. Their spokesman is waiting outside. Fitch motioned to Mandy, who opened the door. A tall, large man came in nervously. "So you want to quit, huh?" Fitch said coldly. The man came forward. Toby and Gunny stared at him. "I'm Ben Miller. We've got our wives and kids to think of. Picking up them plague victims is dangerous." "You've been inoculated," Toby said crisply. "Yeah." Ben Miller wet his lips and forced himself to continue despite the contempt in Toby's face. "Hell, we didn't even have to tell you. We could have just quit. We felt that we owed it to you, that's all," he said. "We'll do any other job that you want done." The door opened. Janice came in quickly. "There's a huge riot at the chemical gardens," she said breathlessly. "Sloat just called. The crowd is getting dangerous. Our men don't want to shoot unless they have to." "Are the rest of the street cleaners outside?" Fitch said to Miller. The man nodded. "Okay, let's go," Fitch said. He and Gunny and Miller rushed out of the room, leaving Toby in charge. Gunny and Fitch split up in different trucks. Inside, Ben Miller said, "Sorry about the street cleaners. I'm sorrier that I was the one who was elected to give you the news." "Forget it," Fitch said abruptly. The ride through the plague-ridden squares sickened him. As the truck speeded past the filthy huts, the old outrage swept through him, leaving him almost weak. The truck was marked with the pox sign to ensure quick passage, and the people scattered before it in all directions. Though the street cleaners had been off duty only 4 hours, already new clumps of corpses lay by broken gutters. In one place Fitch counted 20 bodies stacked up against the side of a building. Flies were thick on one outstretched purple arm. Ben Miller said, "Pretty nasty, huh? It's better when they're stacked that way, though. Easier to pick them up." "Can't you go faster?" Fitch shouted over the sound of the truck to the driver. He and Miller rode up front. The back was loaded with other street cleaners. The truck turned over toward the river. The muddy water was crowded with makeshift houseboats and rafts. Whole families tried to cheat the plague by taking to the water. Miller said, "Those damn houseboats are death traps. My sister-in-law took her kids and went to live in one. Trouble is, the rats like them too. She died. The kids too. I warned her, but she wouldn't listen. Christ, I warned her." He glowered at the water. "We're going to blast every raft and boat out of there," Fitch said. "It's the worst place to be." Fitch was tired of hearing Miller's running monologue. Already he was trying to figure out the best way to quell the riot at the chemical gardens, and Miller was a constant distraction. He looked over at the man guiltily, somewhat ashamed of his impatience. Miller was a big man with a pock-marked face. Seeing Fitch's half-smile, he said earnestly, "You know, I got an idea. You probably thought of it before, but if you buried them plague victims between the two boroughs, Elmira and Bremerton, wouldn't it act as a barricade? People would be more afraid of plague victims than of death, wouldn't they?" Miller's meaning hit Fitch instantly. "Why, you've got it!" he said excitedly. "That would free some of our men, too," he broke off. The truck left the river road and turned sharply to the west. Already the sounds of shots and fighting filled the air. The chemical garden stood up like some gigantic long insect, its metal body held up by the gramps and its girders dangling down to the ground like spindly legs. In some places the rioters shimmied up the girders, but so far most of the crowd was still concentrated on the ground beneath. The truck screeched to a halt. The street cleaners sprang out. Instantly people turned on them. But the street cleaners had been chosen primarily for their size and strength, and they held their own. Fist fights broke out all over the place. Fitch scrutinized the rioters. They were thin and scrawny and half exhausted, but they fought with determined desperation. One group on the fringes had apparently forgotten what they'd gathered for. Abandoning all reason, they danced with erratic motions, yelling and shouting all by themselves. The beginnings of the death dance. Fitch motioned to the guards to break that group up first, for the people's own protection. Even as he stood there, the crowd became more violent, as if lagging energies had suddenly been recharged. Rocks and stones flew through the air. Fitch gave the guards the signal to fire warning shots above the rioters, but this only enraged them further. Again Fitch took stock of the situation. Already more people had arrived, attracted by the commotion. An old woman set up a booth selling cat paws. A man rushed through the crowd shouting, "I've got the plague! I'm going to get you!" He laughed and chased after his frightened victims. But the hard core of the rioters were growing angrier every minute. More of them were headed toward the girders and the entrance to the chemical gardens themselves. Quickly Fitch thought of a plan. He started up the girder steps, which had been guarded, with 3 extra guards beside him. He stood on a ramp about 20 feet above the crowd, and then ordered the guards to open the door into the chemical gardens. "Open the door," the guards said, astonished. "You're nuts." "Open it, and hurry up," Fitch snapped. Only minutes later, someone shouted, "Hey, the door's open!" Heads turned upward. The cry was taken up. "The door's open!" Soon Fitch had everyone's attention. The guard turned on the loudspeakers so that Fitch's voice reached to every ends of the crowd. "If you want food, you'd better listen to what I have to say," he yelled down to them. "Don't listen. It's a trick." "Look there," a man shouted. The people turned their attention from Fitch and looked around nervously. Sloat had ordered another unit of men from the gallery. They had just arrived and were taking strategic positions. "Ambush!" someone cried. "Listen to me," Fitch shouted. "I'm going to hold the chemical gardens, and that's that. This is your food supply. You're entitled to eat. Listen to these directions. I'll tell you where to line up for food." Heads switched toward him again. "How many of you missed the food distribution in the squares this morning?" he yelled. "Those that missed, speak up." The crowd was indecisive and sullen. Then a man called out defiantly, "I missed." "What are you going to do about it?" Mumbles arose. Then people started shouting again. The crowd erupted into an angry chant. "We want food! We want food!" "Then you'll get it, but not by rioting." They turned to one another. They were equally divided between those who wanted to listen and those who wanted to fight. If they really got out of hand, they could wreck the place, and Fitch knew it. He called, "Get in an orderly line. You'll be given a few ounces of food and some milk. Anyone who tries to take more than his share will be stopped by force." Now their attention was undivided. "Food is scarce," Fitch yelled. It'll be scarcer if we don't get additional volunteers to help in the gardens. You can join up in here. Now line up. Anyone who's hungry can get food here from now on, by asking. But from now on, rioters will be shot. You've been warned." Muttering and crowding, the people lined up. The guards yanked troublemakers into a separate line and watched them closely. But the people were still suspicious and looking for a sign of trickery. Fitch knew that he had to hold their attention and focus their energy until their distrust abated. The guards herded them along. Once inside, the people quieted. The antiseptic cleanness of the place awed them completely. The machines intimidated them to such a degree that they even lowered their voices with a sort of frightened reverence. One man yelled suddenly, "Death machines! Mercy deaths! I told you it was a trick!" The crowd trembled, rose to the edge of panic, looked for exits. Like one tremendous hunted animal, they cried out in a single roar. As quickly as he could, Fitch held a paper cup out in front of the machine, at which the man pointed out so fearfully. Milk splashed out, filling the cup. Hysterical laughs, relieved giggles sprang from the amazing faces. "This is a milk machine," Fitch said. "That's milk in there. Look. Pea pods, cabbage leaves, and other leftover vegetable material go in here. Vitamins and fats and carbohydrates are added in this section. The whole thing is mashed and treated, and presto, milk." They looked at him as if he were a magician. He searched Sloat's face out of the crowd and grinned. Sloat had given him the information, but they'd never dreamed that it would quelch a riot. Now the people rushed and pushed to get their cups beneath the spout. Miraculously, the atmosphere had a party air. There were embarrassed smiles all around. Fitch yelled, "Now suppose some of you volunteer to work here," and a volley of raised hands went up. "Them vats are filled with milk," a woman shouted. Fitch nodded. "Milk used to come from cows, but soon the land couldn't support them. Cows, everybody knows, there ain't no cows. It's a fairy story we tell kids." The woman laughed good-naturedly. "No, this is important," Fitch said. "Cows did exist. The gallery will be open to the public when we don't need it as a hospital anymore. You can go there and see pictures of cows." The people grinned. They didn't know whether to believe him or not. As they passed the milk vats, they were handed 2 vitamin cookies apiece. In his pleased surprise to see the people so friendly, Fitch let himself go. He said, "When this is all over, we'll run the bureau ourselves. We'll pass birth control legislation so the people alive will get enough to eat. Maybe the land could even support animals again as well." The mistake was almost fatal. As if by magic, he was confronted again by an unknown and frightening quantity. The people instantly reverted into a mob. This time even the street cleaners joined their sympathies with the people. 2 guards united against him. Fitch saw his error instantly and tried to set it right. The guards stiffened. Sloat made his way through the crowd to Fitch's side. A woman yelled shrilly, "He wants to turn us over to docs!" From her cry Fitch got his clue. It wasn't birth control that the people feared. It was the medical profession. "Sugar cubes," he yelled quickly. "No doctors. Anyone could give them out. Suppose you could just eat a sugar cube and it would prevent you from becoming pregnant." Shouts of desertion greeted him. Sloat, who knew more about it than Fitch did, tried to explain. "Listen," he called out. "We can actually immunize women against pregnancy now, just as we can immunize you against plague. The vaccine is really spermatozoa, and they produce antibodies in the body. The vaccine knocks out invading spermatozoa, making you immune to pregnancy. We've experimented with them, and you could just take them in a sugar cube, but we're not certain of the long-range effect yet. We need more time to experiment. We do know that the vaccine will make it impossible for you to get pregnant for at least 10 years. Sloat's face was white. His voice was strained. He was used to speaking to officials who had some education, and it was difficult for him to use language that the almost illiterate masses could understand. The people shouted him down. A group of men formed a tight unit and yelled threats. Fitch shouted frantically, "You thought that milk vats were dangerous, didn't you? Were they? I said that I'd give you food, and I did. Why won't you believe us now? We told you earlier that the borough doctors left with the officials." There were murmurs of agreement and disagreement. Again the crowd was divided. Fitch said, "What happens to your children now? They go hungry because there isn't enough food. They starve and die," a woman yelled. "I don't care." "They do. Everyone knows it." She thrust a red, defiant face and yelled, "I drowned 2 babies of mine in the river, and I know 10 others have done the same. I ain't scared to say so." The rest of the women argued and yelled among themselves. Some called out, "We want sugar cubes! We want sugar cubes!" But they chanted mournfully, as if they were crying for the moon. Now, however, the majority of the people kept their eyes on the vitamin cookies as if afraid the supply would run out. The immediate danger was over. Already another problem was waiting to be solved. Fitch had to recruit workers to replace the street cleaners, or the borough would be a raging nest of infection within another few hours. The crowd was under control. He turned to leave. A shamed-faced Ben Miller blocked his way. "I'll volunteer to do some of the dirty work again," he said. Fitch looked up in surprise. "I thought you quit." "I changed my mind. Nobody ever gave out free food before." Fitch looked up in surprise. "I thought you quit." "I changed my mind. Nobody ever gave out free food before." "Okay, let's get going, and thanks," Fitch said. Just then Sloat came over. "Guess who turned up as volunteers to replace the street cleaners?" he said. "The people haters." They stared at each other. Fitch said, "Okay, let's not question their motives. We need that work done." Sloat hesitated. "I want to help them." "You what?" "I need you here. I've taught some of the men how to run this place. I'm only needed to supervise once in a while," Sloat said stubbornly. "Why, hell, you're too valuable. I want to do it." There was a strange note to Sloat's voice. Fitch said, "Are you all right?" "Just tired. No worse than anyone else." "We'll talk about it later," Fitch said. "Come on back to the borough building with me. There's some reports I'd like to see." They drove back through the borough. In some places The people haters were already on the job. Sloat and Fitch stopped once to watch. Almost despite themselves, they found the scene horribly fascinating, a commentary on the results of ignorance and apathy. I hate to think what antagonisms the people haters are releasing in this business, Fitch said. I suppose it's logical. They're taking the job over, but I don't have to like it. Or them. They were staring at the same pile of corpses that Fitch had noticed earlier. A group of people haters were tugging at another collection of bodies and piling them into the trucks. Suddenly Sloat swore under his breath, sprang out of the truck and dashed over. "What's wrong?" Fitch shouted, running after him. Sloat's face was livid. His sudden rage seemed all the more incomprehensible and explosive because he was usually so quiet. He swung at the nearest people-hater and sent him crashing to the ground. The man stood up staggering. "You filthy pig!" Sloat shouted. "Look there, Fitch!" He ran to the truck, pointing. Fitch looked in at the bloated pile of purplish bodies and almost vomited. Then he jumped back involuntarily. A body at the top of the pile moved. A woman had been thrown in, still alive. She opened her lips and tried to speak. Despite pallor and obvious exhaustion, she showed no signs of the plague. "I saw that one throw her in," Sloat shouted. "She was conscious, too. She opened her eyes and cried out. I saw her lips move, and he heaved her into the truck with the dead to be buried. Alive! No wonder the people haters wanted this job." "I didn't hear no one say nothin'," the man said sullenly. He didn't hear nothin', the others congregated about. Sloat glowered at them. "Damn filthy business," he said. The commotion aroused the woman. She sobbed out, "I yelled. He laughed and picked me up and threw me in here. I fainted, I guess." She tried to sit up, saw the dead bodies, and grew hysterical. "I'm not dead," she screamed. "Get me out of here." Some of Sloat's composure returned. "We see that you aren't dead," he said dryly. But he and Fitch carried her to their own truck. And then Fitch went back where the people haters waited. "From now on, some of the rebellers will be assigned to each of your groups again," he said coldly. "Anyone found throwing live bodies with dead ones will be severely treated." He watched them for a moment distastefully. "If you can't follow orders, you'll be put out of the burrow, and you can go back to your damn mountain top and rot for all I care." "I never saw anything like them," he said, back in the truck. But Sloat seemed to retire into himself, and he didn't answer. They stopped at the gallery and carried the woman into the administration hall, now an entry ward. Warden Graham came bustling over. "You," he said to Fitch, "you're the source of all my trouble. What have you got here? Another one?" He glanced at the woman briefly and motioned to an artist orderly to take her away on a stretcher. "This place is a disgrace," Graham said. "We haven't nearly enough beds." If the gallery is supposed to be a hospital, it could at least be a good one." He broke off, frowning and squinting his owl eyes at one of his aides who came down the hall. "You," he yelled, "get that man on the second ward out of bed. What does he think he is? On a holiday?" He pursed his lips in old maid fashion. "Fitch just brought in another patient. That's the one thing we've got plenty of, I'll say that." Suddenly Fitch found the whole affair ludicrous, the warden most of all. He burst out laughing. "I fail to see anything funny," the warden said. But he was such a bundle of nervous energy, such a determined organizer even in the midst of chaos, that he only made Fitch laugh louder. Sloat looked at Fitch with instant alarm. He ran over to him just in time. Fitch toppled over and would have fallen on the floor if Sloat hadn't caught him. The last thing Fitch heard was Graham's shrill command, "Give us a hand here." Then everything went black. End chapter 15. Peace, light, and love. Aloha, and mahalo for listening.